tracking whether or not there were keypads on those doors. Why is that piece of information so significant? Is it that it indicates how close the killer would have had to be to the victims to have that passcode?
Yeah, sure, of course, because what we do in these kind of cases is we draw two circles. One is the circle of the victim and everybody that's involved in the victim's life. The other circle is the location where the homicide occurred. So that's the house. Where those two circles overlap, the middle is where your suspect is probably going to come from. So whoever
Brian Enton confirmed there were some incidents at a brewery in Pennsylvania, aggressive flirting with a couple of female bartenders that made them extremely uncomfortable enough that this information was in the system and was flagged at the door. So is this kind of behavior or track record with women significant as law enforcement builds a case and a profile?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, this is something that needs to be explored thoroughly. And let me give you one more if you like that one. For me, this case has really struck me recently when we found out about what this guy's age is. He's 28. It's really hard for me to fathom that he's just getting started perpetrating this kind of behavior at 28 years of age. You know, I'm not inside the room with the police officers making the decisions about this, but they need to take a real long, hard look at his history in Pennsylvania. They need to go to various properties he's lived at. They need to take a look at this guy very, very carefully and see if there's anything that can tie him back to any other instances. You don't get this sudden escalation in violence like this, in my opinion at least, that is, it seems to be so well thought out. And motive is not necessary in court. It's great to have. We see it as a device in entertainment, but it's not necessarily something that you have to have in court. Yeah, and again, Kelly, I'm glad that you mentioned the idea of system. He's not a forensic scientist. He has not been studying forensic science. There was an article that came out earlier today where it was conflating, I think, some of his studies with the study of forensic science. Nothing could be further from the truth. He's a studier of behavior. That's what he was going into, criminal behavior, all right? Forensic science and those things are not the same thing. So he's not going to have the same skill set, say, for instance, as somebody that would have worked in the forensic sciences. He might have an understanding, at least from a spectator point of view, from how crime scenes are processed, but he's not going to know everything, trust me, in this particular case. He is going to be limited in his knowledge of forensic science. He may have made attempts by virtue of what he's seen or witnessed or heard in the classroom to mask some behaviors, but I can almost promise you he's left some trace behind. That's how they've gotten their hands on him at this point.
I think given the brutality of the way these murders were carried out, this is an individual certainly that has obviously some mental health issues. But I think this was more of a signal of dominance or control and revenge. I think the evidence is going to play out that at some point he crossed paths with at least one of the victims, and his interpretation or perception was rejection. He was not someone who could accept rejection because in his mind, he was a controlling individual. And I think the fact that there is more than ample evidence to suggest and prove that he surveilled this home for quite some time, that in carrying out these murders, this was a revenge type of killing.
I mean, there is a lot of evidence here that links Bryan Kohberger to this crime. That said, I just do find it weird. And this is not to say that he did or didn't do it. But Ashley, somebody who has never committed a murder or, as far as we know, even a violent crime, going to a house that has 3 levels, 6 people inside and a dog, where he would go up to the 3rd floor, kill 2 people, go down to the 2nd floor, kill 2 more, knowing that there are other people in the house. And the only thing he's armed with is a knife, doing that with 6 people, never having committed a crime before, knowing that one of the people in the house is a guy who's much more athletic, bigger than him, who could have heard a scream when he killed the first two people and he could have overpowered him? It's a little weird, don't you think?
Well, I was going to say you missed your calling as a defense attorney, but you didn't, because TMZ is really, really popular and successful. So you're doing just fine. But I will say this. I have a theory, Harvey Levin, and that is this. If he's guilty, and I have to preface, if he's guilty of this crime, he showed up thinking there'd be 5 girls. And he didn't expect a boy to be sleeping over, a very big boy, Ethan Chapin. And maybe, just maybe, that stunned him. He was overwhelmed and the battle became pitched. And that was enough for him to say, after the 3rd victim, and then suddenly a very large 4th victim, that he needed to get out of there. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I hear you. But I do think that he knew that Ethan was around that house a lot because he had stalked the house, if you believe the prosecutors, that they have numerous, they have evidence that he had gone there numerous times and just watched the house. So it sounds like he knew the lay of the land inside, which means he knew who was there. And Ethan's girlfriend was there, which is why he was there. And he slept over. So I don't know that he'd be oblivious to Ethan being there.
Hey, good morning to you, Adrian. Yeah, it's been 3 weeks since those brutal murders occurred in this home right here behind me. And so a lot of speculation and a lot of scrutiny is going into the police and their investigative work. After all, they still have no suspects and no persons of interest, at least as far as they've told us. I asked the police some of these tough questions about what they're doing at this moment and didn't get much of a response back. However, along the way, I learned that that could all be part of a greater strategy.
Following new revelations that Kaylee Gonsalves had more significant injuries than Maddie Mogan, her best friend asleep in the same bed, Moscow PD remains quiet in their ongoing investigation. But new information this morning. Moscow PD says it analyzed a reported incident from October and discounted claims that Kaylee had a stalker. The police have narrowed in on an approximate 1 mile by 1 mile perimeter, asking anyone with at-home surveillance videos from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. on the night of the murders to come turn it in. And there's still a cloud of mystery surrounding a nearly 5-hour window from 9 p.m. to 1:45 a.m. when Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle were believed to be at the Sigma Chi fraternity house.
I'm Alex. I'm a reporter with News Nation.
I went to the fraternities and the sororities to find out what they remember.
Just that night, were you here? Was there a party going on or anything? Because the police have this huge window where they're trying to figure out what happened.
The chapter president says he's turned over all information to the police and to the FBI, saying there's nothing they know that the police don't.
And keep in mind,
Brutal murders of 4 Idaho college students last fall. A new report claims the 2 roommates who survived the massacre were awake and texting each other while their 4 friends were stabbed to death one by one. This new revelation reportedly coming from grand jurors on the case and leaked to family members. And the only suspect, Brian Koberger, is still awaiting trial. According to the probable cause filing, one surviving roommate says she witnessed the killer, described as having, quote, bushy eyebrows, walking past her and then out of the home. Prosecutors say they do have Koberger's DNA found on a knife sheath left under one of the victims, and the judge has entered a not guilty plea on Koberger's behalf. Let's bring in Misty Maris, legal analyst and trial attorney. Misty, thank you so much for your time. So this is a new twist. It allegedly comes from grand jurors in the case, but no one is going on record. What was your initial reaction to this potential bombshell?
As far as this is concerned, it's really difficult to verify whether this information is actually true. So let's go through a little bit of the history of the case. When the news first broke about this terrible, tragic killing, we learned that there were 2 roommates who survived the attacks who were in the house at the time. Now, at first we heard that they were both asleep. They didn't wake up till the following day. Then hits the probable cause affidavit. Well, the story begins to change. One of the roommates now had this encounter where she sees the assailant in the house that evening. So this is a dramatic change from the information that was set forth in that probable cause affidavit, if it were in fact the case that the 2 roommates were awake and texting during that time. So what does it mean for the case? Well, that would certainly be contemporaneous evidence relayed in those text messages as to what the 2 roommates heard and saw that night. Now, again, We haven't verified whether or not this is true, and we likely won't know until the trial.
20,000 tips and what will be a second cross-country trip. The suspect in the Idaho college murders will soon be back in Moscow, and it is likely because of evidence that is too small for the naked eye to see. The reports say that Moscow police have matched Brian Kohberger's DNA to some DNA evidence that was found at the crime scene. And that, my friends, is impressive for two reasons. Let me tell you why. The crime scene was a well-known party house visited by hundreds of kids and tenants over the years. So how on earth they isolated just one man's DNA from all the other sources in that house? Well, that in itself is remarkable. And then there's this. Kohberger doesn't have a criminal record. So it is highly unlikely that his DNA was in any criminal database. So how did they track one person's DNA at the crime scene all the way to Kohberger, 2,500 miles away? It turns out it's a multi-step process, and it is fascinating. I'm joined by Joseph Scott Morgan. He is a certified death investigator and forensic analyst. He's also the Distinguished Scholar of Applied Forensics at Jacksonville State University. Okay, Joe, this is your backyard. How do they determine that one foreign source of DNA at the crime scene actually belongs to a killer, as opposed to all the other people who've come in and out of that house invited and party guests and former tenants?
Well, we have to think about those that are currently domiciled in the home, and you begin to eliminate them. Certainly, these poor victims, they have DNA samples from them that would have been taken at autopsy, and then you have the two that were spared down the lower section. They would have done buccal mucosal swabs or cheek scrapings on them and eliminated them. And then any of these parties that would have had intimate relationships where you would have rich source DNA, semen, blood, that sort of thing, you would have gone out if they were given those names and collected those samples. Now, all the other DNA that you're talking about that's in this environment was probably touch DNA, and that's only fragmented DNA that you have. It's not a full partial, it's not a full strand, it's only a partial strand. That comes from the sloughing of dead skin cells. So then after you have all of that, you eliminate everybody that's known, and then if you come up with one person, that's who you have to go after.
Forget it. That to me would have taken years because hundreds and hundreds of kids have come in and out of that house. I thought you were going to say, honestly, that the skin that was under the fingernails of the victims, that's not a party goer, or the blood from the killer who accidentally got cut and shed his own wet blood. Well, no party goer would have shed wet blood that night, or maybe a hair that was on top of a pool of blood. Well, that would have to come from someone who was there after. So that's what I thought they probably collected, as opposed to just some DNA that was found in the house.
No. Let me be very clear. When we say blood in the house, okay, if he did in fact cut himself, and we're assuming that this sample comes from blood, there are other means that you can get rich DNA, semen, saliva, even sweat, Ashley. But in this case, I think that the fingernails are going to, you remember you aired one of the first pieces about this nationally relative to bagging the hands. We're back to that now. Not just skin are you going to have beneath the fingernails, you're going to have blood as well. And there might be hair, full hair, where you have a follicle and you have a root and you can dig into that. That's what's so fascinating about this. And then after that piece, that's when genetic genealogy comes in.
There's been no greater development in solving crimes than DNA. And now that technology has expanded with the use of forensic genealogy. The marriage of DNA using public genealogy databases to identify criminals by identifying their relatives and then closing the circle and coming up with a suspect. Our guest is a pioneer in this discipline, and she has solved murders. She's revealed identities of murder victims and unraveled countless mysteries. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick is my guest on Newsmaker Saturday. Great to see you. Thank you so much.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Okay, Colleen, you're sitting on an airplane and somebody sitting next to you says, "Oh, hi, what do you do for a living?" How would you explain it?
I say that's a really tricky question. I get that at cocktail parties too. I say I work cold case homicides for the police and sexual assaults and unidentified human remains using genealogy. I say I am the person that first pioneered that about 10 years ago.
You did. And I think your first foray into this was kind of finding, what would you say, missing persons?
Well, it depends on how you really count, because my first foray was in 2011 on the Sarah Yarborough case. I was using only Y DNA at the time because that's, what was available. The databases were large enough. I had software that could do all that.
Now, Y DNA or Y is male, right?
Correct. And so I used it to try and predict the last name for the assailant, for Sarah Yarborough's killer. And that's a very interesting story because I came up with the name Fuller, and the genealogist I was matching all traced their ancestry to a Robert Fuller in Massachusetts in the 1600s. So we had a possible name for our killer, and we had his genealogy back 400 years, and 300 years, 400 years, and we still didn't know who he was. Now, 10 years ago, that was kind of weird, but right now, it's not so weird.
You also identified a child. You also identified a child who perished on the Titanic?
Yeah, well, actually, yes, I did. Now, going back, that was 2008. I worked with the Armed Forces DNA Lab on identifying the Titanic baby. Even before that, though, the case before that was Northwest Flight 4422. I worked with the Armed Forces DNA Lab to identify the frozen hand and arm that was found in the glacier in the wreck of the crash of a military charter flight in 1948. Two pilots had found remains at the scene in the late 1990s, and they had spent almost 10 years trying to find out whose remains that was a frozen arm and hand belonged to. And that was my first forensic case back in 2008, but it really didn't use genealogy per se. It was a one-to-one match. They had DNA from the hand, and I traced the family. It was genealogy, but we didn't use Y DNA or databases. We pretty much did the DNA within the legal system.
Okay, if you were going to explain this, when you get DNA from a suspect, let's say, and that person is not in CODIS, which is the database, the DNA database for inmates or people who've been convicted of crimes, you don't have that. They're not in the database. So how do you go about running it up against genetic genealogy that's out there and known? Either it's not 23andMe because they don't do it, right? How do you do it and close the circle?
Well, it's very similar to what somebody would do with an adoption search. We don't use 23andMe. We don't use Ancestry. We stay away from that. I want to make that clear. We use GEDmatch, which is a third party, no testing. All it is a database with some tools. And also family tree DNA databases. That's the only two that we're allowed to use. So, but let me put it in the context of an adoption search. If I was an adoptee, I would sign up for Ancestry. I'd get a kit. I'd spit in a little cup. I'd send it in, and they would take my DNA and analyze it for what we call a marker called SNPs. They're really like points all over the genome. And they would analyze my DNA for about 600,000 of these points. And then they throw my points into their big supercomputer, and they would find out how many of these points, therefore how much DNA I shared with everyone else in their database. They have about 30 million people now. And then sometime later, when they were done, they'd notify me my results were ready. I'd go to log in, I'd go to my results, and I'd see a list of people we call my DNA cousins. And these are people that share certain amounts of DNA with me. So there might be a first cousin, if I'm lucky, a couple of second cousins, an aunt, great aunt, a mix. Now, if I'm an adoptee, I don't know who these people are, but I find out. And then what happens is, because they're all related to me, they're all related to each other. So that means that they have to be sort of self-consistently related to each other. So the genealogist that's involved would take all these people and kind of rearrange them in a kind of a Sudoku puzzle so that everything's consistent, horizontally, diagonally, everything's just fine. They're all related to each other in the way they're supposed to be. And the one point missing through that whole network is me. And that's how I can figure out who I am. That's the short version of what we do.
That is so interesting. So then at that point, you've got to start getting into the investigative part of questioning these people and asking them, okay, who was your father? Who was or some of that may even show up. But you start to close the circle and you can start to work back and find out who your parents were, right?
Yeah, let me say, there's another way to say it, that first of all, when you do adoption searches, you can or you may be able to contact these matches. When we do forensic work, we don't normally contact anybody unless we discuss it with the agency. I mean, distant relatives, it's not a problem. But once we get closer, we don't contact anybody. The agency takes care of that kind of thing. So let me say it a different way, how that Sudoku puzzle works. It's not that hard to understand. What happens is you see a list of people, you don't know who they are. We use public records, we use other family trees that are out there on the internet, and we figure out who these people are. We figure out how, by their email address, for example, how old they are and where they live. Then once we know that, we start building their family trees. So let's say in an easy case, we have 20 matches that we think are worth pursuing. They're close enough. Their second cousins are closer. So we build these 20 family trees and surprise, surprise, they're going to start to connect with each other because these people are related to each other. So we build and build, and pretty soon in an ideal case, we'll have 10 people that are connecting through a common family tree. And we'll have another 10 that are connected through a common family tree, through common ancestors, but the two groups don't connect with each other. And these represent the two family trees of mom and dad. So at that point, we find somebody in one tree that's married to somebody in the other tree, and those must be the parents.
There you go.
And one of their children is who we're looking for, because one of those children, all the children match both of those groups.
Yes.
All the matches, that's how it works.
Got it. Okay, so let's take it into the criminal realm here. Brian Patrick Miller, known as the Canal Killer. These were two horrific murders committed in 1992 of Angela Brasso. She was beheaded. And then Melanie Bernis, who I covered in 1993, who was out riding her bike. She was a junior in high school, went for a bike ride along the canal near Metro Center and vanished. Well, she was found. She was killed and murdered. Then they come up with Brian Patrick Miller. You got involved in that case and kind of sealed it. Can you just give me the long and short of how you did that?
It's actually quite simple. At that time, we were only using Y-DNA. We weren't into ancestry SNPs, GEDmatch. That was still 3 years in the future. Until that point, genealogists were mainly using the Y-DNA, which is the male DNA, which goes along with the family name. So I was in Phoenix for the International Symposium on Human Identification, and I went over to the Phoenix Police Department to tell them my idea about using Y-DNA. In other words, taking their profile from the crime scene and matching it to the Y-DNA genetic genealogy databases and trying to come up with a last name. A match to those databases would indicate a last name, like the Fuller name did. They took me up on it, and I came up with 6 matches to the name Miller. I handed that to them, and that one word, Miller, was enough to solve the case. There was told at one point there were 2,000 people in their case file, and that narrowed it down to just 5 Millers. And of those, Brian Patrick Miller was, an obvious suspect. He fit a lot of the criteria that they had developed. And of course, they collected his DNA, they matched it to the crime scene, and he was arrested, and now he's on trial.
Now, typically in those kind of cases, they get DNA from the suspect off a cup, a cigarette butt, something where they've got a pure sample from that person. They can pull it and then run it against what you already have that was collected at the crime scene, and then you've got it, right?
Yes, it's correct. That's what happened. Basically, same thing. And the reason that works was that the genealogy DNA world used the same markers as the forensic people did. So it was a pretty much a one-to-one comparison. I didn't have to do anything to the data other than sort of minor adjustments. You can just do that comparison directly.
Colleen, this is such a powerful tool now. Why do we even have any serial killers left? Why can't we run DNA from a crime scene and start figuring out who this person is before they can kill a lot of people?
Well, there's a number of reasons that have to do with privacy. This is an emerging field. There's emerging policies. So we want to be careful. You just don't want to go out. And first of all, there's also financial concern, that it costs something to do this. And if you can do it in-house and you can do CODIS right away, do that first. Now, let's say this, any new innovation, you have these early adopters, and it's a risk versus benefit. The early adopters see the benefit. They've been working on this. They're willing to devote the money, whatever it costs, and they go ahead with it. And, there are most agencies are a little bit more cautious. This is a new thing. We don't want to spend the money. Suppose it doesn't work. We don't know the success rate. So they hold off. But once those success stories start rolling in, people become more adapted to it and are more willing to accept it. Now, in the world we live in right now, where we're at, is that you really have to stay in-house with CODIS first. And if that doesn't work, then you can go to genealogy. It's labor intensive. It does take time. It's not just a whiz bang, snap my fingers, and there's the answer. It can take, some resources. So if you can just go ahead and do it in-house, do CODIS, maybe you should do that first, and then if it doesn't work, then you go to forensic genealogy.
Before we take a break, we're going to get to the Idaho case of Bryan Kohberger, because that's the latest where this technology has been used, using a DNA profile and working the family genealogy and trying to come up with a suspect. I want to ask you quickly, though, about JonBenet Ramsey. This is, again, one of the most vexing cases we've seen going back to the early 90s. Do you believe that this technology, family genealogy and DNA, there was some DNA collected at the scene, do you think this might bear fruit in identifying finally once and for all who killed JonBenet Ramsey?
Well, let me tell you some of the practicalities. I can't answer the question. First of all, the whole scene is contaminated by her family DNA, her mom, her dad, her brother. That's all over the place. So are they involved or not? That has been controversy for years. If they were, their DNA's there anyway. You can't really, say anything one way or the other. The other problem is, the DNA survives. Like, they had DNA off her panties, which is, really exciting. But I understand that maybe it was Asian DNA. Maybe they can trace it back to the manufacturer and the packaging facility. That happens. DNA can survive really unusual circumstances. DNA survives the laundry sometimes, even though these were new panties, of course. So even if their DNA is there may be another explanation, a reasonable explanation. So just because there's DNA, I don't know. The only place I can think of that would really yield any information would be DNA from the center of the knot of the rope that was used
The ligature.
to garrot her or
Yes.
garrot her.
Yes.
Yeah, the ligature, I think that would be the only place, in my opinion, just from an outsider's point of view, that where DNA could be obtained that could do any benefit to the case.
Well, as you know, John Ramsey, her father, is pushing very hard to get this stuff tested. There's kind of become a shift in that case where the suspicion toward the family has abated, and people are starting to really think this may have been a stranger or somebody entering that house who did this.
Well, I can't say. I don't know. There is a shift in paradigm. John has been out there speaking with it. I mean, we love to work with him on the case. Again, these are all opinions. John is out there. Maybe she's trying to shift the focus away from himself. I don't know. Maybe nobody knows. We really don't know. And all we have is, discussions and people rendering their opinions. And lots of people would like to solve the case. If he's completely free, of course, I'd love to exonerate him. I'd love to work on that case for no reason. The publicity is great and everything, but I just plain like to solve the case.
Yeah, I can see that. I know it's your passion. We're joined this week on Newsmaker Saturday by genetic genealogist Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. She's been a pioneer in this entire field. When we come back, we'll talk about the case that's top of mind for everybody right now, which is this Idaho murder suspect, Bryan Kohberger, behind bars after DNA from the crime scene was linked to DNA in the trash found at his parents' home, and they came up with Bryan Kohberger. We're back in a moment on Newsmaker Saturday. Back on Newsmaker Saturday with Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, who is an expert in genetic genealogy. She really pioneered this whole science. It's amazing. Idaho murder suspect Bryan Kohberger, behind bars after DNA from the crime scene was linked to DNA in trash from his parents' house. Colleen, can you tell me how that kind of worked?
Well, they had developed Bryan Kohberger as a suspect, so they had to somehow obtain his DNA. Now, why they didn't, pull some trash at his dorm or, a cup he discarded, I really don't know. It could be that, they were just afraid it'd be contaminated with other people's DNA, around where he lived. I don't know. But another way you can do this is familial matching. So what my feeling is that they probably thought it was a better bet to go collect trash from his father because, or his mother, back in Pennsylvania, because maybe he hadn't arrived there yet and his DNA would not be in there contaminating everything. Maybe they thought they could get a pure sample. Now, if they took dad, they could also not only get the CODIS profile from dad, but familial searching when you have males also allows you to use the Y DNA to check the last name. So quite likely they saw that whoever put the trash out was the father of the person who committed that crime and left the DNA at the crime scene, because there was a familial match and also the Y DNA profile matched.
Got it. Okay, so the sample, as we understand it, from Bryan Kohberger, the suspect, was on a knife sheath button, a silver button that had his DNA on it. Touch DNA, we would expect, right? I guess it could have been blood. We don't know. But they got something.
I think it was his. Yeah, I think what happened is that before anything, before he went over there in preparation or at some point, that knife was his. He was touching it, using it, whatever. And of course, he had to put the knife in the sheath and clip it before he went over there, I would imagine. And so he was touching all of that, and that he may have wore surgical gloves at the crime scene, but he had already touched the knife without the surgical gloves.
Got it. Okay.
So when the police saw the knife, they said the best place is the clip, because that's where whoever did it would have clipped the knife into the sheath.
Colleen, DNA testing now has become so sensitive, and you alluded to it earlier in the JonBenet Ramsey case, that you might pick up stuff that I call stray DNA. I don't know if that's the proper term, but it's DNA that's on an object that may not be put there by the perpetrator. How much does that complicate as the aperture is opened and we're seeing more DNA on objects, even from touching it, that you start picking up stuff from people who have nothing to do with the crime?
That is a problem. It's, very sensitive technique. And right now, as far as CODIS goes, there are all kinds of algorithms and ways of deconvolving mixtures, and handling that contamination. I don't know the lower limits on that, but CODIS has been around for 30 years. It's been really, really worked on. Now, in terms of genealogy, that's where we're at. We're trying to understand mixtures. We're trying to understand how we do more and more with less and less, and yet we're still dealing with mixtures. Right now, we can only do mixtures if the perpetrator is the major contributor and a clear major contributor, and there's only two people involved, a major and a minor. If the victim is the major, we can't do it right now. Or if there's a third component in there, we can't do it right now. That is a problem. And that's one reason why they probably focused on that snap, because the only person that would have messed with that would have been the killer.
Okay, and so this was something that I was thinking about in that case. In the Idaho case, you've got 4 people murdered with a knife. Obviously, we believe the same knife, the same murder weapon, which was missing. Now you've got DNA of 4 people and maybe even the perpetrator mixed in on bloody sheets, bloody clothing. How do you sort that out?
You know, it's difficult, of course. You brought up a very common problem. But let me say this, you know, there's in 99 out of 100 stabbings, the killer will injure himself while he's stabbing somebody else. So it's not uncommon. In fact, it's very common for somebody who commits a crime like this to leave his blood at the scene of the crime. How do you separate that out? Well, suppose he cuts himself and he drifts all the way to the front door or the back door. You can say it wasn't the victim. You know, they're in the room and they were killed and it's a terrible scene. But how did that blood get all the way to the front door?
Now we're talking O.J. Simpson.
What's this?
Now we're talking O.J. Simpson. That's about the scenario you just laid out.
Yeah, you know, it happens. That's what happens. And, you know, you look for places where the killer could have touched. Now, a light switch is a possibility, but that might be contaminated because all the people are using that light switch. Maybe if he washed his hands in the sink, then maybe his blood in the sink, maybe on the faucet of the sink. You know, you don't know. You know, this is a common problem, but what you do is you look for places that only the killer would have left DNA, such as the clip on the knife or blood drops going to the front door. And you look for that first. You know, if you can do that, then that's where you get your DNA from.
One more thing before we go. To date, how many crimes do we know of that have been solved with this combination of DNA and familial or genealogy?
Okay, first of all, you don't use familial in terms of genealogy. That is reserved for a CODIS type analysis. We use forensic genetic genealogy, FGG, or genealogy. Now, there was a paper published last year by a woman in Canada, a professor in Canada, that counted 450 cases have been announced. So you can say there's many more that have not been announced that are and those are violent crimes, and I believe also unidentified human remains. Now, there's more than that, really, because sometimes the agency doesn't want to announce anything or hasn't had the chance yet. So, and I also did a calculation. We did an informal survey that there was 100, I took 100 cases out of the news and we figured out how many of those cases would not have been solved had it not been for genealogy. That is, the perpetrator was one and done and he wasn't in CODIS, or the crimes were committed before CODIS was put into effect in the 90s. The answer to that was a minimum of 37%.
Unbelievable.
So you have 450 out there, and 37% of all the cases with FGG, so far as our survey indicates, would never have been solved otherwise.
Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, an expert in genetic genealogy, thank you so much for being with us on Newsmaker Saturday. And for the people who I know